Well, we're going to Alaska. Woohoo! I went to Alaska in 1971 in a Volkswagen bus. Yeah, I drove it up there. I was a hippie. It was the 70s. I grew up in Florida. But I've been there ever since. But I remember as a kid being really confused about where Alaska was. We had this map on the board in elementary school. And usually Alaska had a little box around it. But I couldn't get it together and figure it out why Santa Claus would live in Alaska when it was next to Hawaii. The most popular map in Alaska these days is this one. And that's because of Texas. We just wanted to compare, the size of the state, and it is a gigantic state. But my favorite map was made by a friend of mine, and she just put the rest of the country in the box in the corner. But I like this map because it shows you, really the size and breadth of the state. Where we're going to be this week is the Tongass National Forest, and so we're going to go from here to here. So it may be your first trip to Alaska, but you're going to need to come back. If we just take a measurement from southeast in Ketchikan to Adak out here in the Aleutian Islands, that's 3,000 miles. So it's a big puppy. And we have a lot of different habitats. Where we're going to be all week, like I said, is in a temperate rainforest. The Aleutian Islands, the birthplace of the wind, no trees grow there. I think there is one in Cold Bay next to the Weathered Inn. But, very windy, wild place. Then the south central area where I live in Homer, Alaska, which is right here at the end of the Kenai Peninsula. And then the interior of Alaska, dominated by the biggest mountain range in North America, the Alaska Range, Denali, Foraker. And then that last mountain range divides the Arctic from interior Alaska. Each of those places, the Arctic is a desert. Each of those places has its own habitat, its own animals. So I'm going to try and acquaint you with some of those critters this morning. The big events that shaped Alaska, the biggest for sure is plate tectonics. Alaska sits on the Ring of Fire. It sits right where the Pacific Plate is being subducted underneath the North American Plate. And so there's a lot of action there. There's earthquakes, there's volcanoes, And you'll see in Alaska, we have an average of about 10 earthquakes a day. We don't feel most of them. But it makes it a very dynamic region. It also means that the mountains are getting bigger in most places. They're building. They're being upthrust. And so, we live in a place that's getting bigger while everywhere else is washing away. And that was always really poetic to me. The other thing that shaped Alaska is our glaciers. We have 75,000 glaciers that are currently melting in Alaska. And this is one that you might have heard of. It's called the Ruth Glacier, and it comes down from the flanks of Denali, which is a 20,000-foot tall mountain. And this is where I've lived in my very beginning years in Alaska. I read Jack London, I was all fired up, go to Alaska, and it turned out I had some weird relative that was a whale hunter at the turn of the century and sailed the first steamer to Alaska. So I was ready to roll. I wanted adventure. And I ended up getting a bunch of sled dogs and lived off the grid and didn't have any running water unless I ran and got it. And, 40 years later, I wrote a book about it. You got to kind of you going to write an autobiography when you're 17? I don't think so. But I wrote a book about it, and that's where I raced dogs and had a lot of my adventures, raced Iditarod. A few years after that, after I got out of dogs, a friend of mine called me and asked me to drive her boat. And that was where the whale detective thing comes in. And I moved to Homer, Alaska. Homer is a beautiful place. It's one of the most gorgeous places on the road system. It looks out on the Kenai Mountains and across Kachemak Bay. And it's known as the halibut capital of the world. We celebrate the world's ugliest fish. And I like this picture because, there's you're going to hear a lot of cool history about Alaska. I showed up in Alaska right about the time the guard was changing. So I got to know a lot of these really cool old-timers that lived in Alaska. And there used to be a whole lot of men in Alaska and not very many women. And the women had a saying about that. They said the odds are good, but the goods are odd. Now they have T-shirts that say, Alaska, where men are men and women win the Iditarod. But, I was blessed. I have a daughter. She's named after my lead dog. Her name's Kai. She thought that was real funny till she went to school. and she got a poodle and named it after me. And Kai was always bringing folks home, and I ended up with keeping 2 of them. I call them my wild boys, my surrogate sons, Ben and Michael. And Ben is a Knowles instructor, National Outdoor Leadership School. He works at that. And Mike fishes in the Aleutians Islands, fishes sockeye salmon. And Kai is a rock climber. She always wanted to climb, and when she was little, she climbed the frozen waterfalls that went down to the beach from where our homestead was located. And when she was 12, she asked me to get her climbing lessons, and I took her to Joshua Tree, California, and that's where she's been ever since. She works as a guide sometimes down there, but she still climbs into my books. This is her riding on a moose in a tall tale I wrote called Sitka Rose. There she is on the whale. I'm really lucky because my illustrator is one of my best friends. Most people don't know they're illustrators, but I met mine in a hunting camp 40-something years ago. She was a guide, I was a wrangler. Shannon Cartwright. She cracked me up because in her saddlebag she carried a .45, a buck knife, a tin cup, and a giant box of crayons. 64 colors and a built-in sharpener. And I thought, well, who's this chick? Well, she turned out to be just a piece of work. She was originally from Detroit and had come to Alaska, and she just embraced it 100%. I'm going to live in the bush. So to get to her house, you got to ride the train 60 miles north of Talkeetna and get off and work your way into the bush, and that's where she's been. But when we want to do a book together, lots of times we don't know what we're going to write about. We just know where we want to write it. And so we'll just jump in a kayak or get on the ponies and ride off and just start paying attention. And pretty soon you get ideas. We love to follow the animals around. You know, and if you're an animal living in any of these habitats in Alaska, you better have a survival plan. I mean, it can be a wicked tough place. So a lot of animals just look at Alaska, make a blanket statement in the wintertime. We're out of here. They migrate. Salmon migrate, caribou migrate. Other animals hunker down for the winter, and one of my favorite hibernators is this little ground squirrel. He has a fancy name, Arctic ground squirrel, but we just call him a sick because of the noise he makes. And he goes into hibernation. He's a true hibernator. He dens up the end of August, and he doesn't come out again until May. I mean, he's down for the count. You crawl in his nest, take his body temperature, it can drop to 28 degrees before he starts to shiver. He'll shiver, but he won't wake up. He'll warm up. But he doesn't win the record. The record, I think, is held by a little caterpillar called the willow caterpillar that's got to freeze solid 10 years in a row before it turns into a moth. So these kind of adaptations are rich fodder for a children's author. I live on the ocean, so I'm surrounded by sea mammals, as you will be this week. The one place we might see sea otters like this one is up by Skagway. They come and go. There are a lot in the Monterey Bay area, a few in the Vancouver area, and a lot as we move north into the Gulf of Alaska. We really only hit the Gulf around Skagway once. We're much more likely to see harbor seals, and we will see them floating at the face of the glaciers if we're able to approach the face, or swimming in Creek Street in Ketchikan because the fish are crowding up that river and the seals are just rampant, charging around catching fish, depending on the tides. This is a sea lion, a very big sea lion. Most of you might be used to California sea lions. This is a Steller sea lion, and this species is endangered in Alaska, but it's a giant sea lion. The males, the Beachmasters, can weigh 2,000 pounds, and you know them immediately in the water because they look like a circus. They just are all fins and splashes and rolling through the water, having a wonderful time. One of the animals we won't see is this guy, but I always like to put him in because he's such a quintessential Alaskan animal. Walrus have these tusks, and kids always think they're lightsabers, and they're just sure they are always duking it out there on those far-off flung islands. But actually, walrus are benthic feeders, and they use their tusks to dig in the mud on the bottom. So they dive down and they unearth their food, you know, scallops, clams, sea worms, stuff like that. And this is an ice-dependent animal, and since so much of Alaska's current habitat changes are due to global warming, I'll be talking a lot about that. This is one of the animals most at risk. Wherever you are in Alaska, you're in bear country. That's a good thing to remember. I'll give a wildlife talk this afternoon on 15, but it might be pouring down rain, so I always want to say that. There's a little rule when you're walking around in the woods in Alaska: don't wear your earphones. You want to be able to hear what's walking around with you. And you want to let animals, if you're walking by a noisy creek, make sure that animals know you're around, because they're off in the brush. What we call that tall bear grass that grows on the beach. Perfect place for a nice big brown bear to sink down where you can't see it while it munches on a salmon. You don't want to surprise them. As long as they know you're around, you're in good shape. But they are everywhere, and I live where the biggest bears in Alaska live. They're coastal brown bears. Near Kodiak Island is where Homer is. And all these coastal brown bears are essentially the same species, but it gets a little complicated. I'll talk about it. My other wild boy, Mike, was out fishing out by Chiknik in the Aleutian Islands a couple of years ago. When I say bears are everywhere, check this out. He saw a sow brown bear and 2 cubs sail by on a dead humpback whale. I know, cool, huh? As a writer, I look at this and I think, whoa, what happens next? You know, because usually whales that are dead, you know, they fill up with gas and they explode and sink. You know, so what? Or maybe they float up on shore. You know, so maybe these guys ended up in Hollywood, who knows? But I wrote a book about bears several years ago. I need to update it because we have more than 3 kinds now. This was kind of a Goldilocks take, and that is working for sure with global warming. We have bears moving all over Alaska and changing. So coastal brown bears are the biggest bear now. Polar bears used to be, but polar bears are getting smaller because there's less food. There's less hunting time on the ice, and so the babies that are being born are much smaller and fewer. Coastal brown bears, on the other hand, up until recently, have had all the salmon they ever wanted to eat for the last 10,000 years. So they've had a chance to really expand beyond their roots as grizzlies. And these bears live on the coast. They predominantly eat salmon. And in the springtime, you'll see them just chowing down, taking naps, chowing down, taking naps. The moms are really protective because in the spring, that's breeding season. And the males know that if the sow doesn't have a cub, that she'll go back into estrus. So sometimes these cubs are at risk because of the boars. But so the moms are protective of the cubs. But these big boar brown bears serve a huge purpose in this big circle of life. This is a skinny brown bear. I don't like the skinny ones. And there he's going to alert. He's checking us out. There's a lot of us, though. About 10 of us in this party were at Geographic Harbor, and that's another way you stay safe in bear country, is you just go as a group. 5 or 6 is the magic number. If somebody's guiding you, make sure that guide is the one with the bear spray and he's walking in front, not behind. It's a joke. They run really fast. These bears can weigh 1,200 pounds, stand 10 feet tall, and run 40 miles an hour. We say never go to the beach by yourself. Take your best buddy with you. The slow one. So what do these bears contribute to the overall circle of life? In the springtime, the first fish to come back is the biggest fish, the Chinook salmon. 30, 40, 50 pounds. First food on the agenda for the summer. You know, and they swim up the river and this bear is waiting. He grabs that fish, pops off its head, drags it up on the bank, lies down under a tree and eats it. And he might do that 30 times a day. And there might be 100 bears. And pretty soon, there's a lot of dead headless fish laying around. And they rot, and they bring nutrients into the forest floor. And the biggest trees in the forest grow along those streams. We call them salmon trees, and they play their part. They protect the stream from high winds. They keep it shaded so that the water stays cool, because salmon eggs won't hatch in water that's more than 55 degrees. So, you know, it's a circle of life. It's a symbiotic relationship between the salmon and the bears and the trees. It looks like this. Drama at the salmon hole. So the history of these big brown bears is they started out grizzlies 30,000 years ago. There were 400-pound barren ground grizzlies fighting it out with short-faced bears and a whole bunch of other big predators that lived during the Pleistocene. It was only when the Ice Age ended and the coastlines opened up and the salmon began to roll in that some of these bears left the interior and moved to the coast. And that's how they developed. And there's a little bit more to that story. About 5 years ago, biologists near an island that we're going to pass, Admiralty Island, We're doing DNA sampling on the bears on Admiralty. Admiralty is known as the fortress of the bears. There's a brown bear every 1.4 miles. So it's quite bear infested. And the whole time we're driving into Juneau after we leave Tracy Arm, Admiralty will be on the port side. But these bears, they got the lab tests back and realized that they were looking at a whole bunch of matriarchal polar bear DNA. And so the bears on Admiralty Island are different than any of the other coastal brown bears in Alaska. They probably, in the past, were hybrids. They were probably, far in the past, polar bears. And somehow were trapped in this area, either by water or ice or some other way. Scientists have been able to determine that they think the first bear, what they call the Eve bear, the first polar bear, originated in Ireland 20 million years ago and went into an Arctic ice age then. And this is what we ended up with, these amazing bears in Alaska called ice bears, polar bears. They have all kinds of wonderful adaptations. Their hair is clear and hollow like a lot of Arctic animals, so it insulates them. Their skin is coal black, so if there is sunshine, they can be solar heaters gathering sun into their dark surface. They love to play, they like to, and they also have this ability to really slow down their metabolism during times, fasting times, like in the summer, when they have no access to sea ice and the ringed seals that make up their predominant diet. So they have the ability to lower their heart rate, lower their blood pressure, lower their body temperature, and they begin to wander. And the Eskimo name Nanook not only means ice bear, it means ghost bear, because they're so silent. But they do love to play, and they have a great sense of humor. They like to play this game. It's called I Can Eat Your Whole Head. And they have this whole running thing going with the Air Force in Kaktovik that's pretty funny. The Air Force puts these little blue runway lights out, and the polar bears play a game called Kill the Runway Light. And so they take them down, and they scatter them across the tundra. And then the Air Force comes in, and they put them in 1-ton concrete canisters, and then the polar bears come and scatter them all across the tundra. And this has been going on for a couple of years, but it's pretty funny. So far, it's polar bears 2, Air Force 0. Now, last but not least, we have black bears, but it's a misnomer in Alaska because our black bears can be any color at all. Last week, a guy showed me a picture he shot down at Mendenhall of this black bear that had black feet, but it was a blonde bear. It was like some kind of weird Appaloosa bear. But we have white black bears. This is a newcomer to Alaska. This is a Kermode bear that originated. These are the bears that are so famous from Haida Gwaii in British Columbia. But the last 3 summers we've seen some in the Tongass rainforest, probably because it's getting too warm in British Columbia. And all these animals are in this huge migration north. And as they migrate north, they're, like I said, Goldilocks, looking for a place that's just right. A bear that originated in Glacier Bay, which is just above Skagway, very rare bear, probably the rarest on Earth, is called a blue bear. So we have blue black bears, and also known as a glacier bear, and it became this color so it would be camouflaged. You know, it lived in a world of blue ice and gray gravel and Sitka spruce silver bark, and so it just made sense for this bear to be able to blend in. This Tongass rainforest is one of the most beautiful places in the world. You'll have a chance to see old growth forests, some of the trees more than 800 years old. And sometimes doctors send people as a prescription to the Tongass rainforest to breathe. That might be especially important this week with all the smoke in the air from the forest fires in California and Washington and Idaho. And what happens in the Tongass rainforest is the oxygen content is so high that people are asked to participate in what's called forest breathing. Huh? Groovy, huh? So you can just go hang out in the trees and breathe and ground yourself. The people who live there are the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, and the Haida Indians, or the people of the trees, the Northwest Coast people of Alaska, and they use those trees for everything. And as a result of those trees, they were very rich people. It wasn't hard to find food if you lived in the Tongass. You could jump in your dugout canoe made from your tree, and you could catch salmon or halibut. You could go down to the beach and gather, shrimp from small fish traps or shrimp traps. They have a saying, they say when the tide is out, the table is set, because food was so easy to find. And so their culture had a chance to develop artistically and creatively. And they have wonderful carvings. They believe that everything has a spirit, Inua, and in everything they had to show beauty and respect for the animals, because they believed that they were descended with the animals. And so they belong to the Raven clan or the Wolf clan or the Beaver clan. And these totems that you'll see in Ketchikan are a celebration of their lives, you know, that they survived, and they proclaim who they are, much like a Scottish tartan or crest. And if you go to Saxman, you'll see them carving totems that are still very much a part of their life. Very different from the people who lived at the opposite end of the state, in the Arctic. The Inupiaq, the Koryuk, the Yupik Eskimos, no trees. Very barren land. Everything they had came from the animals they were able to hunt. And so if you're lucky enough to visit the Arctic, you'll hear stories about woolly mammoths and blue bears and blue buffalo and all these animals that these people followed and hunted, you know, for thousands of years. And these aren't just mystical, back in the past Disney creatures to these guys. This is my friend Marie, and that tusk has been sticking out of her backyard for 10,000 years. If you're a kid and you want to earn money for college, you can't work at McDonald's or wash cars. There's only like 3 cars in your village. So you take a metal stake and you walk out on the tundra and you jam it in the ground, and if it hits something, you dig it up right quick because it might be the horns of a blue bison. You know, and in the fall, this guy Tusk Man comes to your village and buys all the ivory. And that'll pay for college if you're lucky. So they can still tell you stories about hunting these Pleistocene critters. Their clothes came from the animals they hunted. Their housing were made from ugaruk, the skin of the walrus or the big seals. And they followed animals. Their lives moved with the migration of the animals. In the fall, they hunted caribou. Wherever you have caribou in Alaska, you have wolves. And wherever you have wolves, you have fiction. Stories about the big bad wolf. And that's where these guys come from. Talk about adaptation. 368 different breeds of dogs descended from the wolf. And in Alaska, the closest one is the Siberian. Now this is a Siberian. These are some of my pups from the old days. And you got to know, when I raced Iditarod, it was like in the beginning. I don't even think wheels were invented then. These dogs' names are Blackjack, Co-Pilot, and Pilot, and they're traditional Siberians. They've got like inner fur, tough feet, good attitude, but they're slower than dirt. We figured out that out the first few years of the Iditarod. It's not a good idea to go 1,150 miles at 5 miles an hour. It takes a month. And this is our race. So we have adapted the dogs to the race. We've bred a super dog. We've gone from this dog to this dog. They're lean, mean machines, and any of you who meet them this week will be really surprised. 50 pounds max. You know, really, really strong dogs, but real lean. And you can't believe how light they are. And they can do something no other animal in the world can do. They can trot 17 miles an hour, 100 miles a day, day after day after day after day after day. So these are Iditarod dogs. You'll get a chance to meet them in the Piazza when Ryan Reddington comes on board and brings his puppies on board. You'll get a chance to meet him when Libby Riddles is talking Wednesday night in Juneau. She was the first woman to win the Iditarod. This is what brought me north so many years ago, the chance to have an adventure like the Iditarod, to see that kind of country, to learn about those kinds of dogs, to really get close to animals. In the early years, you know, the Eskimos basically ran a fan configuration because they were hunting on the sea ice, and if you went through a lead, you had a better chance of being pulled out by your dogs in this configuration. We switched to a tandem hookup when we began to race in the Iditarod, and when the gold rush was going on, going through narrower trails and areas where you couldn't run a fan. And that's become the way that the Iditarod is raced. 14 dogs begin the race. There's 26 checkpoints. In even years, you go the northern route, the red route. In odd years, you go the southern route on the Yukon River. But it's 1,150 miles, no matter how fancy it gets. And boy, it's gotten fancy. The guy who taught me how to run dogs was Joe Reddington, the father of the race. And there's one thing that's still true. I asked him, how do you know a good dog? And he said, a tight tug line. A dog that always wants to work and is an honest dog, they'll beat any of those fancy dogs any day of the week. So a big dog team looks like this. Out in front is your most important animal, your leader. These are Libby's leaders, Dugan and Axel, and you'll hear a lot more about them. My leader, the one I named my daughter after, was Kayana. And this dog, it was a pretty special dog. He'd go into a storm, you know, head on. He could feel the trail with his pads of his feet. I remember training one time up north, and I ran a loop on the highway that went, the Denali Highway that went into Paxson and then back to a cabin that I had off of Brush Cannon Creek. And I was maybe 2 miles from the cabin. It was December and it was cold, so I was geared up, and it was dark. You know, there wasn't much daylight then. But we weren't far from home, and I was kind of, my guard was down, and we went down onto the river, and all of a sudden, you know, it all came apart. When it comes apart fast. And I flew over the driving boat because the sled stopped suddenly, pitching down, and I hit the load, and I was in the water. And at first I didn't worry too much about it. I thought it was overflow, because on those big northern rivers, you know, the ice will freeze so thick, 3 or 4 feet thick, that the weight of it will sink down and the water will run over it. But then the wheel dogs fell back on top of the sled and pushed us down further, and I realized we were in the river because the current caught us. And it happens really fast. You know, your clothes fill up with water, and I only had time to think one thought, and that was, I'm going to drown my dogs. And that's when we came out of there. And by then the sled was upside down, and the dogs were struggling, and there was snot and blood and tears. We came out, and the first thing I see is this dog, and he's just like, hurrah! And you get to live because your lead dog makes the right call in that moment when you need it, most of all. And, you know, that's the relationship that we have with these dogs. That's why we go in these races and, you know, spend our lives hanging out with these huskies, because you get a chance to forge a relationship you wouldn't have otherwise with animals. I wrote a book, you know, about that dog, but I wrote another book a few years ago about all these dog heroes. You know, I frankly don't think anybody would have survived Alaska if it wasn't for dogs. It's gotten to be a fancy race. A lot of money in it now. The dogs have outfits. You know, there's straw at every checkpoint, and people are always trying new ways to get an edge. But it's still 26 checkpoints. This is the one we call the Roan Hilton. If a dog gets tired and they don't want to run, then you leave them behind. You leave them at a checkpoint. And the Iditarod Air Force comes in and picks them up. And I used to fly with a guy named Vice Grips Thompson. And he cracked me up. I asked him one time, I said, Larry, what happens when you get a bunch of dogs in the back of the plane and they get in a fight? You know, what do you do then? And he said, oh, shoot, I just rock it once or twice and they straighten right out. On those nights when the northern lights are ripping through the sky, you call up your dogs, Kobuk, Smitty, and the moisture comes out of your mouth and it gets 3 inches from your lips and it pops. And all of a sudden there are these little frosty stars around your face, and as they fall, they whisper to you. The Eskimos call that the whisper of stars. That's what I was looking for when I came to Alaska. I lived near here for a while. We don't call it Denali if you live near it. You just call it the mountain. And it too is its own little habitat with a bunch of little weird critters around. There's one little bunny that lives at 8,000 feet called the pika. They live all over the world in alpine areas and they eat grass. But on Denali, we have a few meat-eating wabbits, what you call opportunistic feeders. They're called pikas, and they eat birds. How does a little rabbit catch a bird? We have bird blizzards on Denali. In the spring, when the glacial winds blow, they take flocks of birds up to 40,000 feet and flash freeze them, and it starts raining birds. That's okay if it's a little rosy grosbeak, but if it's a duck, you're in trouble. That's why you wear a helmet when you're climbing. And the bunnies pick up the little birds and stack them in their nests like cordwood. Woo! One of my best friends in Alaska, and one of my mentors and teachers, was a guy named Norman Vaughn, who raced Iditarod 13 times and didn't even start until he was 70 years old. He was a character. He told stories that you never quite knew if they were true, like being on the first American expedition to the South Pole with a guy named Admiral Richard Byrd. So I kind of grew up on his stories. Byrd thought a lot of Norman. He named a mountain after him in Antarctica. And for Norman, there was no better place than Antarctica. And he always wanted to get back to climb that mountain. The only problem was that mountain's hard to get to. It's in the Queen Mauds and the Patriot Hills. And Antarctica is a tough nut to crack anytime, even now. So he dreamed and he made a few attempts, but we just about decided he couldn't do it when Vern Tejas came to call. Now Vern's another character in Alaska that you gotta meet him to understand what a great guy he is. On Denali, you know, people would be shivering in their tents at 14,000 feet thinking they were about to die, and he'd ride up on his bicycle. And he'd go, "Wake up everybody, we gotta climb!" Well, he holds the world speed climbing championship. He climbed the 7 summits in 24 days when he was 56 years old. And then he tacked on Carstairs in New Guinea just to keep the record for a while. I asked Vern why he wanted to lead this trip in Antarctica, and I loved what he said. He said, "I know how to dream big dreams, but Norman dreams impossible dreams. I want to learn how to do that." So off they went to Antarctica, and they made it to the summit. And Norman stood on top of his mountain on his 89th birthday. These are the people I came to Alaska to meet. I was fortunate enough to know 3 of the original serum mushers who took the diphtheria antidote to Nome and saved the town. You know, and it was a time when Alaska was really changing. So it's meant a lot to me to be here then, drawn north by the same sense of adventure that's drawn so many before. And that in part drew you here now, just a sense of wonder. And I always like to think of Norma and say, you know, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. So what else do you get from me this week? We're going to become great friends this afternoon if you want to get a little wet. I'll meet you on deck 15 at Neptune's Pool. You don't know where that is, do you? You'll find it. It's emblazoned over the top of it in gold. And I will be doing a thing on spotting wildlife. It might be a little rough out, but it'll be okay. You just claim your seat early, and that is at 1:45 today. And then on Wednesday, Wednesday is a big day around here. We're going to start the morning by going into Tracy Arm. And I have a friend, one of my Iditarod sponsors, Yvonne Chenard, who owns Patagonia, who always says, adventure only begins when you don't know what the heck's going to happen. And that's what happens when we take that left turn into Tracy Arm. We don't know if we're going to be able to get in there or not because of the ice. We may go to Endicott Arm. We may, you know, so it's conditions worthy. So we will be going in there, and I'll be on the bridge talking starting about 7 in the morning. We'll make that really beautiful trip through there and do whatever we get to do, and then head toward Juneau. Juneau is the place you need to see whales. If whales are on your bucket list, there are a million ways to get out into Auk Bay where everybody goes and see whales. Last week, they were bubble net feeding like crazy. And if you don't know what that means, you've got to come to my talk at 11 o'clock on Wednesday and find out. But thanks for coming this morning. I always sell my books up there on deck 7 and autograph them after every talk. If the line's too big, don't sweat it. You're going to see me a million times this week. Thank you.